Hello everyone, Stepan here. I'll continue the series on the Sicilian with a very aggressive opening choice for white against the Sicilian, which is the Richter-Rauzer attack. And even though it might not be as popular as, let's say, the Fischer-Sozin attack or the English attack system or the Yugoslav attack, I believe it's still one of the most aggressive ways to fight the Sicilian defense, and you can only enter it from the classical Sicilian, so it might be the best choice when your opponents don't go into the Najdorf or into the Dragon or something more thematic. Now, before I begin, I would just like to emphasize the input of one player and the attribution to the theory of the Richter-Rauzer attack by Garry Kasparov. I think you should definitely study his games in order to comprehend the opening and to understand all the variations, especially his games from the mid-90s and the late 90s. There are a lot of beautiful victories he got in the opening. Okay, so about the history of the opening, it was named after Richter and Rauzer, of course, one Soviet-Ukrainian and one German chess player from the 20th century, and they didn't really contribute to the modern theory that much. They've just been one of the first players to play it seriously, but I would say that the opening was developed at the end of the 20th century, and the theory developed in the 90s especially. There have been some new ideas since then, but it's been fairly straightforward and not much has changed since then. And it remains a very strong weapon, as I said. So let's get into the opening. e4, c5, the Sicilian, knight to f3, knight c6, d4, the open Sicilian, cd4, knight to d4, knight to f6. And white defends the e4 pawn with knight to c3. And now, in the last video, I've covered an opening in which black plays e5, and we've been going over a lot of variations, and the Richter-Rauzer attack starts with the classical Sicilian, in which black continues with pawn to d6, not going for chasing the knight away or something more aggressive. Black simply prepares to develop his pieces and to get a small center, so to speak, with pawns on d6 and d6. And the variation starts after white plays the move bishop to g5. This is now the Richter-Rauzer attack or the Richter-Rauzer variation. Now the next two moves the next move for black is almost forced. Black plays e6 here because black doesn't want to allow white to capture the pawn on f6 and to have to recapture with the pawn. And white's idea is similar to what black does in the Nimzo-Indian. Black in the Nimzo-Indian wants to exchange his bishop for the knight on c3, and in the Richter-Rauzer attack, white would like to exchange his bishop for the knight on f6 when the circumstances are favorable. That is when black is basically forced to recapture with the pawn. If black gets to recapture with the piece, then it's not a big deal. So the point of bishop to g5 is either to retreat the bishop if the circumstances are unfavorable, or even better, to capture when black has to take with the g-pawn. And very often in these lines, black is going to have doubled f-pawns, so that is something to keep in mind. Another thing that players with the black pieces should be aware of is that in the Richter-Rauzer, your king is going to be stuck in the center either on e8 or on e7 more often than not, and definitely more often than in most Sicilian positions. Sometimes you're going to castle queenside, sometimes you're going to castle kingside, but I would say at least a third of the time your king is going to remain in the center, and you're going to have an unsafe position. Now, that being said, the position is not bad, the position is just aggressive for both sides. Okay. Now here I would just like to go over one sideline briefly. The second move, queen to d2, we are going to go over, is by far the most common, but one sideline is bishop to b5, the Vitolin's variation, named after one Latvian player. And that can be played, it's just slightly unusual because white is basically offering to open up the the b file, and white is going to castle queenside anyway, so that might seem a bit counterintuitive, but that happens in some other variations as well. Here black continues with bishop to d7, and now white captures with the bishop. Bishop takes c6, bc6, queen to f3, threatening to capture on f6 twice, h6. And here white actually doesn't capture on f6, white plays bishop to h4 and he keeps the tension. g5 would weaken black's position too much, and black here continues with queen to b6. Now this isn't really a pawn sacrifice, of course white can't capture on f6 and g takes, queen takes, because the knight on d4 is hanging. White castles queenside here, so after castling the b pawn is defended and the d4 knight is defended as well. And now you can see that the pawn is hanging on f6, so bishop to e7 and knight to b3. And this is the start of the variation of the Vitellins line in the Richter Rauzer. And as I said, it might seem a bit counterintuitive to offer to open up the b file, but the position is perfectly fine. The two knights are doing a great job defending the white king. And the black king is actually in more trouble than white's king, because white has a lot of pressure along the f file and white is almost ready to push his kingside pawns. But as I said, that's a sideline that you are not going to see very often. However, if you do play this position with the black pieces, if you do play the classical Sicilian, you have to be aware that white doesn't have to play queen to d2 here, even though it's the most common move. But let's go over queen to d2, and there are more than 10,000 games from this position with queen to d2. This is a very thematic position, and what white is basically trying to do, white is trying to castle queenside as soon as possible and attack on the king side. That's the main plan. Now, white is going to have two main attacking setups, and one of them is going to be with f4, another one is going to be with f3. Now, f4 gives white more chances for a quick attack, of course, and f3 gives black less counterplay. So if you play f3, then your e4 pawn is defended, and in the Richter Rauzer, the e4 pawn is often going to be white's main weakness in the position, and black should usually strive to place his bishop on c6 and put pressure on the e4 pawn. So with f3, you are still preparing to attack, same as in the English attack setup. You would play against the dragon or something else, or the Najdorf, but the attack might be a bit slower. And with f4 you can see that e5 is immediately on the cards, which is a common break, etc. So yeah, f4 or f3 are the main plans of attack. So the position continues with a6 here, and black doesn't play a6 simply to prevent knight to b5. It's also to be able to play b5 as soon as possible and perhaps bishop to b7, because black's main source of counterplay is queenside play, and it's already clear that white is castling queenside, and in fact that's white's next move in any game, in every game, and black is simply preparing the move b5 as soon as possible and trying to strike on the queenside to gain as much counterplay as possible. So a6 has to be played. Castles is the best move and the only move almost perhaps the only move ever played. I mean, there have been some more moves played, but this is by far the best. And now the position branches out. This is what you're going to get probably without spending any time on the clock for either side. This is just too well known, and this position is the start of the real Richter-Rauzer attack. And here black gets to choose between two lines, and they are quite different. One of them is bishop to d7, another one is h6. Let's go over the h6 line first. Now, to h6, white can respond in three different ways. It's clear that you are going to have to retreat the bishop at some point or take the knight on f6. As I said at the start of the video, white does want to exchange the bishop, but not if the situation is unfavorable for the trade. So if you take on f6 now, black is simply going to recapture with the queen and have an okay position, putting pressure on f2 and being perfectly fine. So in the lines with h6, you don't capture on f6, you retreat the bishop most of the time. There is one sideline I would like to mention, which actually wasn't played that much until the late 90s, and it's sort of a new idea, and that's the line with knight takes c6. And in this line with knight takes c6, b takes c6, white is once again voluntarily opening up the b file to his own disadvantage, but it has some threats. White here continues with bishop to f4, retreating the bishop, and black plays d5. And in the h6 lines of the Richter Rauzer, there are a few things you have to remember. Now, for black, d5 and b4 are the main ideas. Of course, black can't play b4 in this line with knight takes c6, but d5 can be played. b4 and d5 are the main sources of counterplay and two moves which would cause the most trouble for white. If b4 is played, then the knight has to move from c3 mainly to e2. And if d5 is played, you can see that black has a broad center which can be utilized easily. And that's why it's fairly common for the player with the black pieces in the Richter Rauzer to try and go for an endgame as soon as possible and to try and trade as many pieces as possible to make sure he could utilize his broad pawn center. Now, I'm sorry, somebody just entered my office. Once d5 is played, black, of course, has a huge pawn majority in the center and can try and think of some ending positions already. Now, it doesn't mean that white is worse in this position. In fact, the engines will tell you that white is always better, but white has given black quite a lot of counterplay. Now, the position continues with queen to e3, bishop to b4, putting pressure on the c3 knight, and now we are going to see the point behind knight takes c6 and how white gets enough counterplay as well. Here bishop to e2 should be played, developing his last minor piece and castles. And now once the black king has committed to the g8 square, once the black king has castled, white has a clear plan of attack. White wants to attack the king side as soon as possible. So e5, dislodging the knight from the defense, and the knight on f6 is the main defender of a castled king on the king side. So after e5, once the knight has to move, black is already weakening his defenses significantly. Knight to d7 and retreating the knight. Queen to g3, threatening bishop h6 right away. King to h8, queen to h3, now threatening, of course, bishop takes h6 once again, and after pawn takes, queen takes. Bishop takes c3, forcing the queen to take. You don't really want to, you can't take on h6 because bishop b2 check and you lose a pawn. And if you capture with the b pawn, then your position is too weak, so you do spend the move taking with the queen. And now after queen b6, you simply bring your queen back. So white has a clear plan of attack, and white is faster than black, significantly faster. If you go back, after knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop f4, d5, you can see that even though black has a favorable structure, white has committed his pawn to e5 and it's weak there, it's only defended by pieces for now, but white gets a lot of activity. And here queen to h3 is actually pawn sacrifice, you can see that, so queen takes f2, and after bishop to f3, black has 7 pawns, white has 6, but now knight takes c5. Yeah, you don't want to recapture with the bishop immediately because you lose the bishop. So yeah, once knight takes e5 is played, if you capture with the bishop immediately, then queen to e3, and after king b1, queen takes e5, so that wouldn't work. But after knight takes e5, rook to d2, queen to c5, bishop takes e5, white is a piece up, but the position is actually equal, only slightly better for white, because now black gets to play f6, and after bishop to g3, this broad center is going to be quite significant for black, and is going to prove to be almost enough compensation. So this is a line in which black actually sacrifices a piece for, well, it's for 2 pawns, but those 2 pawns are very scary. You can already see that black can create 1 or 2 passed pawns in the center, and that could be enough compensation. And the highest rated game from this position was Martin Clemente Joel against Vosaklich Jerzy, I think that's pronounced that way, who are both 2600 grandmasters, so very strong players. Let's go back in this position. So okay, knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop to f4, d5, queen e3, bishop b4, bishop e2 castles. White is attacking on the king side, dislodging the knight, allowing black to capture the f2 pawn and getting a piece for 2 pawns. Yeah, so if black does decide to go for that, this position is fine. Just remember not to take the knight before you play rook to d2, because then you are just a pawn down. Now in this position, instead of knight takes c5, which is the only move, I don't really know what to suggest for black. The engine thinks king to g8 is the best move, or king to h7, and that all seems to be equal according to the engines, but apparently it's really hard to defend, because if you, let's say if you play something stupid like bishop to b7, then this sacrifice is just winning and there is no way to defend. So you can see the evaluation bar on the right side of the board. But any other sensible move such as king to h7 can be punished with a lot of activity right away with a move such as rook to f1. So you can see that the piece sacrifice isn't forced, but it is forced. I don't know how to put it. So you sack a piece and rook to d2, queen to c5, and you take here. And now at least you can defend, and you have, well, the dark squared bishop isn't perfect on g3, and black has too many pawns in the center, and it's actually great compensation. And this position isn't equal, but white is only slightly better. So yeah, I wanted to get into this line with knight takes c6, which actually has a lot of venom, and if white plays it properly, it could be a very strong weapon against the classical Sicilian here. And remember this line. As I said, it's a fairly new idea and it hasn't been played much. Okay, let's go over two more common moves now. Another move that white could play after 8 h6 is either bishop to e3 or bishop to f4. Bishop to f4 is not that commonly played. It's the third most popular move. You might wonder what happens after e5, but that's actually a bad move for black, because knight c6, bc6, bishop e5, the queen is hanging with checkmate, so you lose a pawn. And yeah, this position just isn't good. So d5 can't be played. So after bishop to f4, you play bishop to d7, firstly stopping this threat, because now the bishop is defended 3 times. And now after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, f3, d5. Two common plans are being put into action. Black is putting his bishop on c6, putting pressure on e4. You already have 3 attackers now. And black is pushing through with d5. And this position is perfectly fine for black. This position is just equal. And this is why I think that bishop to f4 shouldn't really be played. Even though it's an okay move, I think it's not active enough. So I would recommend either knight takes c6, which we just went over, on move 9 after h6, or the main line after h6, bishop to e3. As I said, it doesn't make sense to capture on f6. You retreat the bishop because the queen can take on f6. And here black has 2 responses, either bishop to e7 or bishop to d7. Let's go over bishop to d7 first. After bishop d7, you create an English attack setup, or you play f4. I think f3 is simpler to play and safer to play, because the bishop is coming to c6. In fact, black can immediately capture and play bishop c6. So b5, and after b5, which is black's common plane, either d5 or b4 now, black is threatening b4, so you take on c6, bishop takes c6, knight to e2, black is putting pressure on e4, trying to push through with d5, queen to c7. In most positions you are going to play king to b1, but here it's not really necessary. Knight to d4, attacking the bishop, bishop b7, bishop to d3, finishing your development, and e5. And in most Richter-Rauzer positions, white is going to be utilizing the light squares and black is going to be utilizing the dark squares. And this is a perfect example of that. And especially in positions where black pushes e5, you can see that there are already significant holes on the light squares for black. Knight to f5, d5, trying to push through in the center and break white's bind on the d5 square. E takes d5, knight takes d5, and this is where I would like to stop. So this is the position with bishop to d7. Now, in all of these positions, the engine is going to like white. That's just the way it is. And I think it's objective, as opposed to some other Sicilian positions. I think white actually does have an advantage here, because white's king is much safer and white is up in development, definitely. Okay. But after bishop to e3, black doesn't have to play bishop to d7. I think bishop to e7 is a better and a more sensible move, just trying to castle. And here, white has 2 main responses, f4 and f3. f4 going for a quicker attack, f3 going for an English attack with a safer center, more solid center. Let's go over f4 first. So f4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, b5. Black goes for his queenside pawn push and his queenside attack. Bishop to d3 developing, bishop b7, king to b1, putting the king into safety, and castles. Now, it's clear what both sides want to do. Black wants to play either d5 or b4, and white wants to play h3, g4, g5 and crush the black king. I think this position is easier to play with the white pieces, at least for humans. The engines, I think, agree with me, and this is slightly better for white, but it's almost equal, and I think that the advantage is more significant than 0.3 or 0.4. I think that most humans would choose white in this position, even though black stands fine. I mean, black has sort of what he wants. He's going to push through on the queen side. He has pressure on the e4 pawn, and you can see that already now, if b4 is played, then the pawn is hanging. But white is the first to play. So e5 here. This is white's common break in the position. d5, f takes e5, dislodging the defender. As soon as this knight moves to d7, you can see that there are a lot of sacrifices that are going to happen on h6. And h6 is probably the square at which white most commonly sacrifices in the Richter Rauzer. Yeah, another tactical trick that white can commonly play if the queen comes to a5, which it often does, is the knight to d5 trick, which, especially if the bishop is on e7, can often lead to being a pawn up or even winning the position. After knight to d7, white continues with knight to e4, indirectly defending the g2 pawn and trying to put the knight into some key squares, trying to get the octopus knight on d6. So the bishop has to take, and let's face it, the knight on e4 was much better than the b7 bishop. Bishop takes e4, rook to c8, c3, queen to c7. And yeah, I would like to have white here. I don't know about you, but okay, black has b4 coming in and stuff, but I would always have white in this position. And that's why I think that in the main line, after bishop to e3, bishop to e7, f4 is a better move than f3. But let's go over f3 now. So f3, going for a safer, slower, more solid attack with more control in the center. Knight d4, bishop d4, b5, king to b1, rook to b8, and here there is an intermezzo move, a tempo move, which seems to be the most popular in modern theory of the Richter Rauzer, which I don't really know what it achieves. It gets the rook from b8 to b7, which might be significant, but that's what I think the move is about. Is you play bishop to a7, attacking the rook to provoke rook to b7, and then play bishop to e3 back to make sure that the black bishop doesn't have the b7 square. And that's what I think the reason is behind the move. But you did waste the tempo, and the rook could easily transfer to along the 7th rank here. And if the rook wasn't on b7, then let's say rook to c7 or rook to d7 wouldn't be possible. And since black wants to push through with d5, I can see the move rook to d7 being useful. And that's why I'm not sure whether you should interpose the move bishop a7. Now, if you don't, after rook to b8, you simply play bishop to e3. I'm sorry, you simply play after rook to b8, you can simply play the move knight to rook to b8, b7, yeah, the move bishop to e3, but that wouldn't really make sense. You want to have pressure along the d file, and it's a common plan for white to use the semi-open d file, but I'm not sure whether the position with bishop on e3 is better when the rook is on b7 or on b8. But yeah, it's for you to decide. But however, the main line is bishop a7, rook b7, bishop e3, queen to a5, trying to put pressure on white's queen side, and now knight to d5. And this is the trick I mentioned. You normally get more than in this position, because this is fine for black. But in some positions, when the king has already castled, you can either gain the bishop pair, or if the rook is on b8, you could even win a piece like this, or force the queen back to d8. The point is that if, let's say, the rook is on b8 and the king is castled, if the queen captures the queen, then knight takes e7 would win a piece with check, and then you recapture the queen. So in some positions this could bring you more than here, but here queen takes d2, knight f6 check, gf6. Black doesn't really want to take with the bishop, because then the d6 pawn would be undefended. Bishop takes d2 and e5, and this is the starting position after f3, and I just don't think that white has as much as in the f4 line, so I would always prefer to play f4. And I have to say that I'm an e4 player, and I like playing against the Sicilian, because I think white often has enough of an attack, and the Richter Rauzer is a great way to attack black. And I like attacking positions, I like Maroczy bind positions, and apart from the Maroczy bind, I think the English attack and the f4 line against the classical Sicilian in the Richter Rauzer are my favorite setups, and I think this is just great. So you have to choose. In the h6 line, after bishop to e3, if black plays bishop to e7, which is the most common move, I would suggest f4, but it's for you to decide whether you want to play f3 and f4. Garry Kasparov, who I've mentioned earlier, has played both moves, and he's had success with both, so check out his games, see what suits you best. But let's go back to castles on move 8 for white. Black doesn't have to play h6 here, which we just went over, which is one branch. Black can play the main line with bishop to d7. This is the main move, more common than h6. And here, white can also decide between f4 and f3. Once again, I would suggest f4, f3, bishop to e7, and here you can choose between two moves. And the positions are okay for white, but I don't find them as comfortable. Once again, you might feel comfortable in them, so don't take my subjective opinion seriously if you don't want to. Here, white should continue with h4, and after h6, you don't take the knight once again. You don't want black to recapture with the piece, so bishop to e3 and h5. One key thing to remember for black is that once white pushes h4, you want to play h5, stopping the pawns on the king side, because if white pushes through with h5 and then g4, g5, black is going to be lost. Here, bishop to g5, back to the same square makes sense, because now the bishop can no longer be dislodged. And another thing is that after bishop to e7, you don't have to play h4. You can play bishop to e3, simply returning the bishop, which you don't want to exchange on f6 anyway. And here, black should continue with h5, stopping white's plans. White plays king b1. Queen c7, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, bishop d3, b5. The position is similar, but you can see that the difference is that the pawn is on h5 for black, and that black seemingly has a faster attack than in the h6 lines. And that's why I don't like the move f3 against bishop to d7. I would recommend the move f4, which is the main line. And once again, Garry Kasparov has played both, study his games. After f4, the line is straightforward, but white has a faster attack than in the f3 line. b5. Bishop takes f6, g takes f6. In this position, black doesn't really want to capture with the queen, because you can get a very fast attack in with knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and here. And black is in a lot of trouble. I mean, the center has just opened up greatly to white's advantage. So after bishop takes f6, you take with the g-pawn. And this is what I was talking about. White wants to capture on f6 when black recaptures with the pawn. Now, black isn't forced, but black is better off taking with the pawn here. After g takes f6, king to b1. Always play king b1, safety first. Queen b6. Putting pressure on the d4 knight, knight c6, bishop c6, the black bishop belongs to c6, putting pressure on e4, and now f5, opening up the king side, and more importantly, fixing the weakness on f6. And the main plans for white in this line with the bishop coming to d7 are to stop d5 for black. That's one thing. Put pressure on e6, f6, and if possible on the h-pawn, whether it's on h5, h6, or h7, or block it with a piece. So that's the main thing. Stop d5, put pressure on e6, and f5 does exactly that. If you manage to open up the center this way, those pieces are going to have a major role in the attack. And as I said, black is often going to leave his king on e8 in the Richter Rauzer, and this is a perfect example. If I turned on the engine, it would say that the position is equal, white is slightly better, 0.4, 0.3. And the best move, according to the engines, is castles here. But if you castle with the black pieces, then you don't have that much counterplay, so I wouldn't suggest castling. It might be sounder and positionally safer, but I think you should play b4. And after b4, you get counterplay. And this is the main move for a reason. Knight to e2, forcing the knight back. Here, taking here is an okay move, but you allow white to open up the center to take on e6, which is always very dangerous. So I wouldn't recommend that move. After knight to e2, I would recommend d5, simply blocking the center and not allowing white to capture, and then trying to put pressure here. So white is going to play knight to g3. I think this is just much faster, much safer. If you allow not to castle, then allowing white to capture on e6 and having to recapture with the f pawn seems like suicide to me. Here black continues with h5, trying to dislodge the knight. If black gets h4 in, then the knight moves back to e2 and bishop takes e4 for free. So h4 stopping that. Queen to c5, getting into white's position. Queen to e2, putting pressure on h5, and here king to e7. King to e7 tries to connect the rooks, tries to, once the bishop develops to h6, have the rooks connected for the attack on the queen side, but hangs the h5 pawn, which is okay, but once again I would always have white in this position. The point of queen to e2 was to defend the e4 pawn. So now after king e7, knight h5 is actually on the cards, and bishop to b5 attacking the queen, queen to g4 defending the knight, bishop h6, bishop to d3 trying to exchange the bishops, rook h to g8 attacking the queen, and queen to e2 defending both the bishop and the g2 pawn. And if white captures, you are going to capture with the rook. Now queen to e3 trying to exchange the queens, but now first bishop b5, a b5, queen b5, and queen to a7. After queen to b5, taking on e4 is risky because you lose the rook. After queen to b7 check, so you have to retreat the queen, and this is still theory. There's a lot of games from this position even, and this is a thematic position in the main line of the Richter-Rauzer, and this is what you have to memorize. According to the engines, this is much better for white, but it's still been played by grandmasters, and this is why I think the Richter-Rauzer is a great attacking setup for white. You are often going to get strong attacking positions, even if black plays okay. So my recommendations: if you have to choose between f3 and f4, choose f4 because it's more aggressive. If you like positional chess, then choose f3. Remember a few key plans for both sides. If you're white, attack on the king side. Play either f3 or h3 and strive to play g4, g5, h4, h5, etc. Use the semi-open d file. You can often have tactical tricks with your rook and queen here. If you put your queen on e1, then you will often have tricks of capturing the e5 pawn or the e6 pawn because the queen is going to be on d8. Remember the tricks with putting your knight from c3 to d5 if the queen is on a5. That's a very common plan. If you're black, use b4 to dislodge the knight from c3 and gain space on the queen side, and use d5 to create a strong pawn center. If you manage to get d5 in, your position is going to be fine. Block the h file, play h5, don't allow white to push through with h5. Attack e4, put your bishop on c6, put pressure on e4, that's white's main weakness. Use the dark squares if you are black, and there is a common plan of playing, if the pawn isn't on e5, of playing bishop to h6, bishop to f4, and bishop to d5, and you can often get an attacking position like this. If you manage to put your bishop on e5, then your position is great. So yeah, attack the queen side if you are black, attack the king side if you are white. I think the position is fairly straightforward. You have to know two lines. You have to know after castles, this is going to happen in every game. If you're black, study one of these, either bishop to d7 on or h6 in great detail. They're very different, they're very risky, and I think white is better in both lines. But who am I to speak? Many players, including Karyakin, Vasily Ivanchuk, Vladimir Kramnik, I don't know, countless grandmasters and even world champions have been playing this with the black pieces, so the position is fine. I just think it's easier to play with the white pieces. And if you are an e4 player, add this to your repertoire. It's a great attacking weapon against black. Okay, thanks very much for watching. I hope you got to learn something against the Richter-Rauzer. I hope you got some new attacking ideas about how to defeat the Sicilian defense, the classical Sicilian. And if you're black and you play the classical Sicilian, I hope you got to learn something and you got to solidify your knowledge in the Richter-Rauzer, because I'm sure you face it often. yeah, I have put the link to the introductory video on the Sicilian defense in the description below. Check that out if you're unfamiliar with the basics. And thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye.